The Australian Financial Review.
Chris Reed had just stepped off a flight from Zurich to Dusseldorf. It was November 2008. In fact, it was his birthday. But rather than celebrating with friends in Perth, this scion of a famous mining family had spent his birthday on a work trip to a laboratory. But it was in the hallways of that laboratory where a chance encounter changed the course of his life.
I was waiting to go into a meeting. A couple of elderly gentlemen came out and said, you're the young kid with the vanadium project. We're going to need you in 10 years and go and find some lithium. I was like, oh yeah, okay, no worries. And so I went into the meeting and I said to the guy from Policius, who were the two old cats there? He basically said, whatever they said, you want to listen to it. And what did they say? And I said, I don't know. He said, son, go and find me some lithium. And I was thinking, what the bloody hell does he need lithium for?
The Reed family mining company had lost 75% of its value in the previous 6 months, and they needed a bit of luck to go their way. That day in Dusseldorf, it did.
He looked at me and he said, well, one of the guys was the head of R&D at Daimler. The other one, R&D at Johnson Controls, the world's biggest battery maker. He just said the future of transportation is going to be electric. And I thought, oh, okay. The good Lord's given me quite a few shake-up moments, and I figured, well, this was one of them.
If you're not familiar with Daimler, they're the $90 billion company that make Mercedes-Benz vehicles. And that old bloke who told Chris to go find some lithium, he wasn't leading him astray. 6 months after that day in Dusseldorf, Daimler had bought 10% of a small American electric vehicle startup company called Tesla. So even though Chris had grown up in the famous gold town of Kalgoorlie, and even though he was the fourth generation in his family to work in mining, he'd never really given a second thought to lithium. And not many people had in those days.
When I got back into Zurich, I got out the laptop, looked out, how do you get lithium? It's in brine deposits in South America. And I thought, well, that's a bit hard. And then they said, you get it in pegmatites, spodumene. And instantly it just dawned on me. I said, well, I used to drive over that stuff.
Since the age of 17, Chris had been driving over a rocky outcrop on his way to the small gold mine his family company was involved in at Mount Marion, south of Kalgoorlie.
That's how I knew where it was. It used to be hard as hell. Big white pegmatites. Everything else was much, much softer. And we used to have to rattle these utes going over these ridges. We used to Jesus, what is this stuff? It's, hard as the knobs of hell. And it was spodumene. So, it was just curious that, I don't know, the first time I went out there was probably in the early 90s. It was serendipitous that I remembered where it was and that we could get our hands on it.
The Reed family company spent a couple of $1 million to take possession of the Mount Marion leases with a view to mining lithium for the batteries that go into electric vehicles. By 2017, the punt had paid off spectacularly. Lithium prices had almost tripled, and Mount Marion was one of just 3 Australian mines selling lithium into the boom. By mid-2018, there were 7 Australian mines. Suddenly, everyone was rushing into lithium. But that's when Chris decided to get out.
We made, just under $250 million off of a couple of $1 million investment. So I think at that point, we're happy with the transaction.
Chris's mind had already turned to an even bigger opportunity. It's still in lithium, and once again, he's an early mover. In the past year, this big green idea has started to get real traction. And by a twist of fate, Daimler and Mercedes-Benz have come knocking on his door, wanting a piece of it.
Hi, I'm Chris Reed, CEO of Near Metals. Today I'm going to tell you how we're going to build one of the world's greatest recycling businesses.
Everyone knows we need to do something about climate change, but what's not clear is how do we fix it?
Low emissions technologies.
There is net zero modelling.
Change is coming, whether you like it or not.
Change isn't just coming, it's already underway. We're living through a massive industrial revolution where just about everything we do is going to have to change in less than 3 decades. Empires are going to crumble and fortunes are going to be made. I'm Peter Kerr from the Carbon Challenge team at the Australian Financial Review, and this is Tech Zero, It's a podcast about the big green ideas that could get us to net zero and the inspiring people who are putting their heart and soul into making them work. Before you can get your head around Chris Reed's belief that the big bucks are going to be in recycling lithium rather than mining it, you need to get your head around electric vehicles. You go for a walk on the TAN track around Melbourne and you see all sorts of electric vehicles. That looks like a Nissan Leaf over there. Hello, Alan. Nice to see you. This is Lab. To help us do that, we put Australia's former chief scientist, Alan Finkel, in the electric vehicle hot seat.
Do you want me to rev the car before I start?
Please, I'd be excited. So here we are in Alan Finkel's electric vehicle. First thing I noticed, Alan, the seat's warm.
Very warm because you've got the button on high.
Wow. So, is there any chance that we've drained the battery of your electric vehicle just making my seat warm?
So it has intelligent systems, so let's do the experiment. I'll turn off both our seats. We'll look at the range, which currently is projected at 233 kilometres. No change. But if I put the heating on, you'll see a change.
It's gone down to 196, so we've just lost about 40 Ks.
Correct, because it's presuming a certain number of hours. So if I was driving very fast, the loss wouldn't be as much, like on freeway driving. But if I was puddling around town, the loss would be higher. It doesn't exactly know.
Long before he was Australia's chief scientist, Alan was the Chief Technology Officer for Better Place. They were the company that briefly looked capable of dominating the world's battery charging market. Now, Better Place was ahead of its time, but also its corporate strategy probably wasn't quite right. It went into liquidation in 2013, but Alan's passion for electric vehicles was not dimmed. He's since owned 2 Nissan Leafs, 1 Tesla, and even had a brief trial of a Toyota Mirai, which is the hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicle. It's about almost a decade since you got your first electric vehicle. What was the very first thing that you noticed with your first EV that was different to driving a petrol car?
I would anticipate that you think that I'm going to talk about the silence of the electric car, but in fact the most mind-bending difference about driving an electric car is the instant response when you touch the accelerator. It just wants to leap ahead. In a petrol car, when you press the throttle, let's say you push it to the floor, that opens up in an older car carburetors and the flow, in a more modern car, pumps and injectors, but it takes time. It can take 0.2, 0.3, if you've got a turbocharger, maybe 0.4 of a second before you get a lot of response. In an electric car, it's electronics. Within milliseconds, the motor is delivering full torque if you flatten the pedal. And that responsiveness it's just a lovely feeling, whether you're always operating legally, overtaking or starting off from the lights. It's very pleasant to have that connected feeling to the car.
And what was the experience of the battery with your first electric car?
So the first electric car, the battery experience was not great. It was designed as around about 150 to 160. I think it was 160 was the original range. But over a 6-year period, and not a lot of kilometres, I think we only drove about 35,000 kilometres in 6 years, that startup range from full just got worse and worse and worse and slowly went down from 160 to 150, and after 6 years was down to about 99,
wow,
100. So it lost to a whole third of its range. And at that point it was quite nerve-wracking to drive, because even though we mostly used this car for just suburban driving, sometimes in a day you're going to get towards 100 kilometres. So we needed to make sure every day we were starting with a full battery, and as I said, it was not a comfortable place to be. So we saw that battery lose its full charge range just steadily over the 6 years. But we loved the car and did a deal with Nissan to upgrade at a bit of a discount because of that to the modern car, which had a much higher initial range. It's not huge, but it's 270 kilometres initial range, and I haven't seen any degradation yet. So I'm very pleased with the battery performance. When I was looking at batteries in the electric car industry in 2010, we assumed that 8 years would be pretty good, 10 years would be maximum. But now I'm relatively confident that 10 years would be quite normal as a range, and the good batteries might last considerably longer than that.
In my petrol-powered car, if I run out of battery or my battery needs replacing, that's not a really big deal, a couple of $100 I can get a new battery. Is it that simple for EV cars?
So an electric vehicle has two batteries. It's got the same kind of 12-volt battery that your car would have for accessories, the one you're talking about, but it's also got the big, powerful traction battery for driving the vehicle. And Bob's your uncle, depending on the car and the size of that battery, it could be $10,000 to replace, it could be $30,000 or $40,000 to replace.
They might be named lithium-ion batteries, but there's plenty of other valuable metals in there too. There's typically nickel, cobalt, copper, graphite, aluminium, sometimes even manganese. The European Parliament reckons that by 2030, the continent is going to need 18 times more lithium and 5 times more cobalt. By 2050, European demand for lithium would be 60 times higher, and cobalt demand 15 times higher. To make the task even more challenging, these minerals tend to be produced by a small number of countries. Now, that's not a huge concern in the case of lithium, which is dominated by stable countries like Chile and Australia and those in North America. But cobalt's a very different story. More than 60% of world supply comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo, a country that's struggled through civil war, extreme poverty, and concerns that its mining industry is riddled with human rights problems. One of the big opportunities for Australia, I guess, is that we're, depending on the day of the week, biggest producer of lithium or second biggest producer. We have a fair bit of nickel, and we have the type of nickel that is ideal for batteries, a bit of cobalt. We make a lot of the stuff that's essential. And people who watch the markets will be noticing that all these Australian mining companies are signing deals with Tesla. Is the world going to be able to get enough of the minerals that go into batteries through traditional mining, or do you think recycling these batteries to harvest those minerals back again is going to be needed?
I think recycling is absolutely going to be needed. One of the challenges as we go through the clean energy transition, which is solar, wind and batteries and transmission lines, is just the sheer volume of resources that we need to build all of that. That needs lithium for batteries and nickel and manganese and cobalt, but you also need copper for connecting everything. Electric cars got 4 times as much copper as a normal car. Wind turbines use huge amounts of rare earths and copper and steel and aluminium and concrete to build them. The demand for resources across the spectrum of special materials and critical minerals is already high and going to get much, much higher. And it would be irresponsible to only look to de novo extraction for everything. So you can imagine a world in the future where we're in steady state, where we've built all the solar panels that we need, all the wind turbines that we need, and we've got 1.5 billion electric cars on the road. We should then be recycling materials as the old batteries and the old solar panels get to the end of their useful life.
There already are some big companies recycling lithium-ion batteries. Glencore, Umicore, they're among the biggest players in this space, and they're multinational companies with market caps in the tens of billions of dollars. They've already built their facilities right in Europe, where the big fleet of electric vehicles are already on the road. So in that context, how could Chris Reed's little company from Perth, with a market cap below $500 million, possibly compete? Well, it's because he's going to do things differently. And we'll tell you more about that after the break. The most common method of recycling these batteries today is to cook them at super high temperatures in furnaces. That's called pyrometallurgy. And Chris reckons the economics of that model are unbelievably attractive.
The incumbent guys use pyrometallurgy. They'd put it in melting pots or kilns that would burn the plastics, burn the electrolyte that has lithium in it. It's in a hydrocarbon gel, so that'd flare up. Incinerate the graphite, which is 40% of the battery, and then end up with a little dirty metal button. Probably the best legal economics I've seen.
But Chris's company, Neometals, They've developed a method that uses acids and other fluids to extract the metals, rather than heat. It's called hydrometallurgy, and it borrows heavily from his background in mining.
So you get the batteries, you shred them up, the equivalent of putting them into a concentrator, right? So we discharge them, disassemble them, and shred them, put them through a crusher. We separate out the plastics, the copper sheet, the aluminium sheet that the anode and cathode go on, any plastics or steel casings. So we separate that out and you're left with a black mass. It just looks like a big pile of crushed up pepper, right? And it's got the graphite anode and the cathode, which has got nickel, manganese, cobalt, lithium in varying amounts. And we put that into sulfuric acid. And then we use solvent extraction, pioneered out at Mount Isa last century, to sequentially take out the base metals as sulfates. The lithium comes out last, and then we're left with an ammonium sulfate tail.
This podcast would become a hardcore chemistry class if we explained every step in Chris's process. But the key difference is that he's using a more expensive reagent to extract the aluminium and iron from the batteries. To be precise, he's using ammonia rather than sodium. And the advantage of doing that is that once all the metals have been extracted, the stuff left over will be a usable product rather than waste.
Innovatively, we've used ammonia as our reagent. That means instead of getting a nasty sodium sulfate tail, we get ammonium sulfate tail that can be used as a fertiliser, and we had a very modest price on the ammonium sulfate in the economics, and with the advent of, what's transpired in the Ukraine and the effect on fertiliser prices globally, it's now at the point where it'll make a significant impact on the economics.
So you're a Kalgoorlie kid and you come from a family that's 3 to 4 generations Kalgoorlie. Mining's in your blood. Did you get any strange looks or any sort of raised eyebrows when the family business, this company was once called Reed Resources, suddenly wasn't pursuing a mining project, it was looking at recycling?
Yes, in short. Yeah, people wondering why you would go into recycling.
The hard thing about mining is that you spend big dollars digging stuff up for a long time before you can start selling it and making money. But in recycling, your feedstock often comes for free. While the Reed family are famous for mining, they're not complete strangers to recycling. When Chris was a teenager, he had a job in a family business, which gave him an insight into how lucrative a business can be when the feedstock comes for free.
Our family had interest in recycling businesses back in the 80s, and we were pretty well aware of what the underlying economics can be. Ours was more around bottles. Some of our cousins, they had, and my grandfather were involved in a business called Golden Mile Aerated Waters. We used to make cool drinks in Kalgoorlie, the Mexi drinks, and then the factory in Perth used to make ginger beer, and then had a bottle recycling business. So you used to collect them in sort of 1 cubic metre steel bins that we used to put at the back of restaurants, and then store them and then jack them up, put them on a conveyor belt and pick off the different types of bottles, flagons, used to wash them in caustic soda for reuse. Well, it was 1987. I was in year 10, so I had a very quick learning curve on recycling.
There's one big disadvantage to recycling batteries through the hydromet process that Chris wants to use. Hydrometallurgy is a more expensive method of recycling batteries for electric vehicles. How much more expensive would it be? Double, triple?
My guess is that would be the quantum that you'd be looking at.
But the hydromet process has 2 big advantages. It reclaims much more of the minerals than the pyrometallurgy process does, and it requires far less energy, and that means it's got a lower carbon footprint. So is it right to say that your process gets 90% of the battery minerals back?
In our pilot plant, we've said that we get 85% as an overall recovery rate. That was in SGS Lakefield, just north of Toronto.
Canada. Yep. Okay, great. And the traditional rivals, pyrometallurgy, what sort of
Umicore and Glencore.
Yep. So what percentage recovery would
what
they
recovery
get?
rate do pyrometallurgists get? Well, you incinerate the graphite, so that's 40%. Mm-hmm. Then you incinerate the electrolyte and the plastics. They would be battling to get over 50% recovery. And then there's the CO2 footprint. So if we're making 1 tonne of batteries out of raw mined materials, the footprint's about 8 tonnes of CO2 per tonne of batteries. If we use pyrometallurgy, it's about 4.3 tonnes. If we use hydrometallurgy, we've been at 1.5 tonnes, and we want to get that down to below half a tonne. The decision to go down the more expensive hydromet route was really driven about what the market needed in the long term. Certainly in Europe, where they're not blessed with the natural resources, they don't want anything to leave. They're selling expensive cars. They can afford to get the batteries into the union and into the cars. And they're going to want everything back. So driven by recovery. And the way to get the highest recovery was to go through hydromet and not incinerate things. More expensive, that's the cost to us. The benefit is that we'll be able to operate in that regulatory environment.
The European Parliament adopted strict new battery recycling targets in March this year. It wants 75% of light vehicle batteries to be recycled by 2025 and 85% by the end of the decade. At last count, barely half of Europe's batteries were being recycled. The batteries will also need to contain a minimum level of recycled cobalt, recycled lead, lithium and nickel. And batteries are going to have to carry a label that reveals the carbon footprint of their entire life cycle. That's going to favour recycling too. Chris reckons there's not nearly enough battery recycling capacity in Europe today to cope with the tidal wave of extra batteries that are going to come on the back of these rules.
We think there'll be about 250,000 tonnes of batteries that need to be recycled in 2025 in Europe. The total installed capacity in Europe at the moment would be about 70,000 tonnes. Sungil, which is part of Samsung, about 10,000 tonnes. Umicore, 7,000 tonnes. Glencore, 7,000 tonnes. But a lot of the base metal smelters, it's going to be hard for them to grow and to get licensed in the new world. We have seen the regulations, they wanted to come into effect, I think, in 25, whether that's during the year or at the end. And it basically increases the recovery rates that you need to achieve to be deemed a recycler. Then you've got mandatory carbon reporting. So cell makers will have to declare how much CO2 is in the cell. And, car makers will have to declare presumably how much CO2 is in the footprint of the car.
When these European Union rules kick in, is that the end for recycling batteries through cooking them in a big furnace?
Look, I think they can make some changes to their process and try to improve it, but they'll need to change their processes. Now, can they get there? Look, I'm sure they can. Maybe doing some work at the front to eliminate what you actually put up the stack. But even still, the smelting is a key part. But, in time, all roads lead to hydromet refining.
The rubber started hitting the road for Chris and Neo Metals last year. They struck preliminary deals to build recycling plants for a Canadian steelmaker and a Japanese trading house. They built their own demonstration plant in Germany to show proof of concept of the recycling for their potential customers. Demand was strong enough for them to build a commercial plant that does half the job. It shreds the batteries and sells them in the form that Chris described as black pepper earlier on. But the big validation of Chris's plan came in March, when Mercedes-Benz chose Neo Metals to guide it through its first steps in battery recycling. The deal won't settle until Mercedes officially send through a purchase order, but assuming they do, Chris's team will design and construct a plant for Mercedes in the German town of Kuppenheim.
We're looking to build them an integrated 10-tonne refinery and enter into an R&D collaboration for 5 years and train them up on recycling. That's essentially with a view to building them plants and getting royalty streams going forward.
My memory of the deal with Mercedes-Benz, the Mercedes-Benz subsidiary, was that they had to purchase some equipment for that agreement to become legally binding. Are we there yet?
That's certainly being well advanced and is on target.
Yeah,
so,
cool.
Yeah, it's a matter of essentially supplying them a plant. So they're building facilities at their Kuppenheim operations in the western sort of side of Germany. You got to engineer it, obviously, and then give them the contracts to supply them a plant. We will embed staff with them and be able to test the latest and greatest cells and compositions of batteries and formats, and co-own the improvements. It's great for us. It was a 16-month process, a global process, as you can imagine. So yeah, we're very happy to have been picked as Mercedes technology partner to recycle. All of these car makers are going to have significant volumes of cars. We've got a very, very strong pipeline of people who are very interested in using it. Obviously, once you announce that Mercedes have picked you as a technology partner, that certainly sped up and crystallised a lot of commercial negotiations, because they've done, arguably the deepest technical dive. These guys invented the first modern automobile, anti-lock braking, the safety cell. They're pretty innovative.
Making money out of recycling lithium-ion batteries is going to be more complicated than the bottle recycling business that Chris worked in as a kid. The big car manufacturers aren't stupid. They're not just going to throw used batteries in the bin like people do with bottles. But Neometals has disclosed some pretty attractive numbers to the stock market. It has suggested the cost of recycling 1 tonne of batteries will be about $1,600. The value of the metals recovered from that same process will be above $16,000 based on this year's commodity prices. That's a 10-fold increase. Sounds like an easier way to find critical minerals than heading out to the outback and doing some blind drilling in the hope you find something.
Having developed quite a few mines, I've been fortunate I've had more successful ones than unsuccessful ones. Yes, we think it's been well worth the exercise. And for all things being equal, we think we've got a brighter future at the other end of the lithium supply chain.
While he sees a bright future for recycling, Alan Finkel reckons we're going to need to keep mining lithium and other critical minerals out of the Earth's crust for quite a while yet. That's partly because there's not enough batteries needing to be recycled yet to meet the demand. The fleet is just too young.
While we're growing at the moment, we're going to need new resources. Like, there aren't enough 10-year-old batteries in all of the world to provide the lithium, manganese, nickel, cobalt, copper and other things that we need to build the current year's battery needs. It's only as we go up, there's an S-curve of adoption, and we're in the very early stages, but as we get into the faster middle level, and certainly as we get beyond that towards steady state, we should have vast quantities of batteries out there in the system coming to the end of their, say, 10-year life.
So therefore, do you think that for battery recycling industries, they're going to really come into play late 2030s?
They'll probably come into play mid-2030s perhaps, but there's already opportunity to do some recycling. And we don't want to wait until the 2030s to start developing the technologies, because getting these technologies to be efficient and themselves not damaging and getting them to be cost effective is not easy. Most things take 10, 15 years to go from the early demonstration projects to really mature, capable technologies that are delivering the cost effectiveness and the volume handling that you need. So now is the time to be investing.
Chris Reed agrees that the next decade is not the main game for the recycling industry. It's the decades beyond that.
The best years for this business are 2030 to 2050 at least. It's been a great journey when we're 6 years into it and we're only just starting. The tsunami of batteries doesn't really start to get interesting until the second half of the decade. In 2030, even if we recycle every battery in the world, we'll only supply 10% of what's required for that year's new production. It's not till 2040 that you get to probably 40 to 50%. So it's a fantastic business with a very, very long life for us. Even if they stop making lithium batteries today, you're still going to have yesterday's production to recycle in 10 years' time.
So the world wants to be net zero by 2050. What do you see for electric vehicles and your battery recycling business by then?
Well, we would want to be the recycler of choice for the car makers, essentially. So we would want to be deploying our large plants. So the 500 tonne a day plant's about 200,000 tonnes capacity per annum. If you're producing 1 million EVs, that's about 400,000 tonnes plus of batteries. And we just want to be ready to build what the market needs, and to recycle as much as we can, and not have to, because the last thing we want is to be constrained by lithium that inhibits the growth or the penetration rates of the EVs.
Thanks for listening to Tech Zero. Join us next week when we go to Bacchus Marsh in Victoria to meet a self-described mad scientist who reckons he might have found a way to solve the carbon footprint of Australia's single biggest export industry. If you like the show and you'd like to hear more, follow us on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. And consider giving us a review or a rating, as it helps others to find us. This podcast was hosted and written by me, Peter Kerr, produced and edited by Lap Fan, technical production by Cormac Lally and Rob Fletcher. The artwork was by Yerevan Delanchian, and thanks to Tom McKendrick, Dave McMillan, and the video and audio teams of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. And a special thanks to 6PR radio station in Perth. This podcast was executively produced by Fiona Buffini. At the Australian Financial Review, we investigate the big stories about markets, business and power. You can subscribe to the Financial Review at afr.com/subscribe. If you want to get in touch with us at Tech Zero, you can email us at techzero@afr.com. Tech Zero is part of the Financial Review's Carbon Challenge franchise.
The Australian Financial Review.